Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today for this side event on strengthening the UNCAC implementation review mechanism. This is an event that is organized by the UNCAC coalition together with Switzerland, Honduras, and we will also have a speaker from the anti-corruption coalition Uganda. Thank you very much for joining us here in the room, and to everybody who is joining us virtually online. With this event, we're trying to discuss avenues to strengthen the effectiveness, the transparency, the inclusiveness of the UNCAC implementation review mechanism. We want to look at different perspectives. We will have speakers representing governments, we will have speakers representing civil society. We're trying to take, so to say, a 360-degree angle on the review mechanism. We want to hear from the government's perspective and how they are actually coping with implementing the review themselves. Maybe also hear some insights from the role of governments as a reviewer. We will hear from the perspective of a national NGO that tries to use the UNCAC review mechanism to contribute to advance reforms, to impact change. And we will have the perspective, the bird's eye perspective from the UNCAC coalition, where we will look at what are, from the global perspective, the strengths, but also the challenges, the weaknesses of the UNCAC review mechanism. And this is, I think, an important time at this point to start the conversation on reflecting on the future of the review mechanism as the second cycle is advancing, slowly coming to an end in the coming years. And as you may know, after the end of the second cycle, which is scheduled to take place in 2024, parties will have to decide what is next with the review mechanism. And I think now is a good time to take stock and think about what we could do to strengthen the UNCAC review mechanism to ensure it is effective, to ensure it informs reforms and technical assistance, and that it is done in a way that includes all the relevant stakeholders. So I'm very happy to introduce you to a panel of experts that will share their different perspectives on the review mechanism. We have here with us in Sharm el-Sheikh, Marcela Matamoros, the Director of Transparency of the Secretariat of State in the Offices of Transparency in Honduras. And we have here from civil society, Sisi Kagaba, the Executive Director of the Anti-Corruption Coalition Uganda, and she is also a board member of the UNCAC Coalition. I'm Matthias Huter, I'm the Managing Director of the UNCAC Coalition, and joining us remotely, we will have Martin Matter, Head of the Economic Affairs Section of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland. Welcome. And my colleague Corinna Gilfillan, a senior analyst with the UNCAC Coalition, who is also joining us remotely from Washington, D.C. So to get the conversation started, my first question would be to you, Martin. What has been your experience with the UNCAC review mechanism? From your perspective, you have been working on the UNCAC review for many years. What is your view on how it works?
Yeah, thank you, Matthias. First of all, for organizing this meeting. It's really good to join you, at least virtually, there in Sharm el-Sheikh. It's true, we have accumulated some experience now with this UNCAC review mechanism. I would say Switzerland is subject to 3 such mechanisms, if we count the OECD working group on bribery and also the Council of Europe's GRECO. And compared to the other 2 mechanisms, I would say that the UNCAC covers a very broad range of issues, but it doesn't really dig very deep. It is also quite soft in the sense that it does not put a lot of pressure on the countries concerned. I mean, generally speaking, review mechanisms, they work with peer pressure or public pressure or both. But in the case of the UNCAC, there is very little pressure at all when it comes to following up on the results, on the observations made by the reviewers and the recommendations. These results, they are processed and analyzed by the Secretariat in an anonymous and very generalized fashion. The meetings of the implementation review group, as we all know, they are closed to the public, and NGOs are not allowed to attend. And therefore, we could say that in theory, the IRG offers a good confidential space for a frank exchange of views among the state's parties, but unfortunately, that is not what happens. It's not used in this manner. And there's another difference with the working group on bribery, for instance, or the GRECO, where the countries concerned usually face tough and detailed questions, and they really feel a lot of pressure, becomes quite uncomfortable sometimes. This does not happen at the IRG, and I think that is a pity, because like this, the confidential space really remains a comfort zone, and that doesn't put any pressure on the countries concerned. As I mentioned before, the UNCAC mechanism is still a young mechanism. It is can still grow and improve. I think the soft characteristics, they were due to the fact that for many countries, this was the very first review exercise that they cautiously embarked on. But by now, I think we have all become acquainted with it, and it is certainly timely to ask the question, how can we strengthen this mechanism? I'll leave it at this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin, for a lot of food for thought already in your first response, and we will come back to the question, how can we do better? Marcela, you're involved in, or you're just in the process of doing the second cycle review in Honduras. So far, what has been your experience with the review mechanism?
Thank you. Good afternoon. Issue of you, especially Mr. Matthias Hunters, our moderator, Corina Gilman, Cici Kawaba. Nice to meet you for being in this space. My country has always been open to the UNCAC coalition mechanism, expressing its political and budgetary will in order implementing actions that lead institutional strengthening of our administration, to the adoption of legal instruments that really contribute to the frontal fight against the corruption and the implementation of the recommendation by the mechanism and the evaluation of our country. Based on these recommendations in the first cycle, during the second cycle, actually, we are instead of the on-site visit on February 2022 about the evaluators, Trinidad and Tobago and Cook Island. The date this result is great progress and good practices. On November 22, the Transparency Secretary was created, raising the issue to the highest level and providing today an institution that's governing body and coordinate the promotion and culture of transparency, fighting for the corruption, integrity, probity, and obviously the promotion and coordination of all public policies of the open state, who became a strengthening to the mechanism of social oversight and strengthening the state of law and legal security. The Secretary has played a crucial role in the co-creation of comprehensive policy strategies as the first policy of transparency, integrity, prevention of corruption, as well as the open data policy, as we the open data charter, and we are working together to the validation official to the first national strategy of transparency and anti-corruption enjoyed and worked together with UNODC. Let me tell something about. We are proud of the first installation in our country for the first office of the UNODC in Tegucigalpa that provides a special technical support to more than 18 institutions that are relation with greatest demonstration of political that is going to be fighting to the corruption in Honduras. Likewise, this year we are commemorating the first 10 years of the Open Government Alliance in our country. We implement 4 increasingly comprehensive action plans. We are committing in response to the immediate needs of population throughout the national territory. Highlight at this point is the integration of more than 200 institutions that make up an open government ecosystem in the country, with representatives of private sector, civil society, academia, and youth initiative. It's proper to mention that in 2013, the public minister has obtained only 62 sentences on corruption and all for minor crimes. And there's never a person recognized as investigate and themes of political, economic, and social. Is that a significant advance to our country? The Secretary of Transparency is within a framework to the Open Government Alliance that we create a space, frank dialogue with civil society, private academy, and youth initiative. We already signed a memorandum with the UNODC with a technical assistance to our country that is significant to the fight to the corruption.
Thank you very much for this overview. Sissi, you lead a civil society coalition in Uganda. Please tell us what your experience, your view on the UNCAC review mechanism, your role, so to say, in Uganda has been.
All right, thank you very much, and good afternoon and good morning to the respective people who are tuned in. At organization level, one of the things that we did as a civil society organization was we came up with a power report. But we need to appreciate the fact that much as we came up with a power report to the review process, participation of civil society organizations was very, very minimal. And as long as participation of NGOs or civil society is not obligatory, you'll always find it very difficult to get into those spaces. You cannot expect government to audit itself. Otherwise, it's going to become a process of just ticking boxes. The process is still slightly closed. It's not as open as it should be. So I think much as we participated, but not all accountability NGOs were invited. The space is still somewhat closed. So in our part, yes, we came up with a power report, but we don't even know whether the power report is binding on government. We didn't even know that the reviewers were coming. I mean, there wasn't really enough information that was available to civil society organizations regarding the review mechanism. Yeah.
Thank you, Sissi. Already a lot of, so to say, challenges from the civil society perspective that you have alluded to. Corinna, you have spent several months researching the publicly accessible documents on the review process. You've looked at many of the reports and executive summaries coming out of the second cycle review. Please provide us maybe with a summary of what your findings on the UNCAC review mechanism have been so far.
Yes, thank you very much, and I'm excited to take part in this event today, albeit from afar. Yeah, so I've spent several months now going through over 70 documents, mainly for the second review cycle, to try and get a picture of how the review mechanism is working in practice, and also looking particularly at implementation of Article 13, which is focused on promoting the participation of society in anti-corruption efforts. And after going through all these documents and giving it some consideration, we basically have come out with a report today that provides the findings from this review. But going through all of the different reports, I think that it is important to recognize that a lot of these reports, country reports in particular, have really important information about anti-corruption regimes in countries. And I think you can see that the mechanism has helped to identify weaknesses in the legal frameworks and to identify concrete recommendations for improving things. And I think the review mechanism overall has helped to generate some momentum for making some changes. However, I think that the review mechanism could be much more impactful. And what we did in our review is we identified the major shortcomings in the review mechanism that is hindering its effectiveness. And we believe, the UNCAC Coalition believes, that the IRM is crucial to the effective implementation of the UNCAC. So what our report does is basically outline the key shortcomings that we're finding in the mechanism. There are 3 key shortcomings that we need to address. One has already been discussed by my colleague from Uganda. This is the need for greater inclusiveness in country reviews. We're seeing over and over again that it's very, very difficult for civil society organizations to get even basic information about the status of reviews so that they can take part, so that they can contribute in the process. And that's not just for civil society, that's for all a range of non-governmental organizations as well, including the private sector that can make contributions. Another key shortcoming that we found is a lack of meaningful transparency, both within the process and the lack of a clear form and related to the process internationally. And I think that this again speaks to the need for more transparency, not just around the review process, but around key documents around the review process. For example, country reports. We're finding that most of those aren't online, and the executive summaries tell you far less information. And then a third major shortcoming that we found is a lack of a clear, informal follow-up process to make sure that recommendations from reviews are actually implemented. And this is a huge gap in the review mechanism. Martin was speaking of this earlier. And I think that what we did in our report is also look at other anti-corruption monitoring mechanisms, and we're seeing that the review mechanism is behind those mechanisms as far as, especially in transparency and a lack of formal follow-up process. You really can't have a review mechanism that's going to work effectively if you're not able to check to make sure that countries are actually fixing the problems that were identified. And I think there have been growing calls, whether it's from the UNGASS political declaration, the UN fact panel reports that came out this year that shows, that identified some deficiencies in the process and called for improvement. And finally, I just wanted to say that we looked at Article 13 implementation in countries. How are countries engaging civil society? And what we're finding is that there really needs to be a lot of improvement with that. About 50% of countries that we reviewed had recommendations related to strengthening Article 13 implementation. And if you look at the country reports, there really isn't a lot of information provided often on what the actual impacts were of engaging with civil society and other stakeholders to know if it really led to tangible outcomes and impacts. And there really wasn't much examination of the enabling environment. We know that there's a shrinking civic space globally. It's becoming very difficult for anti-corruption activists to operate. And yet these country reports don't really look at the enabling environment for civil society to speak out against corruption and to take part in UNCAC implementation. So those are just a little bit of the highlights from a report. It's called Keeping Up with the Times that we're actually releasing today at the CoSP.
Thank you very much, Corinna. And I invite all of you who are interested to learn more about her findings and some recommendations that we're putting out to inform the discussions moving forward. Go to the UNCAC Coalition website and you find this new report there. We would be really interested in actually getting feedback, comments from all stakeholders so that we have a better understanding of the different perspectives and expectations towards the review mechanism. So thank you, Corinna, for this overview. Martin, we're in a situation where I guess the terms of references for the review mechanism have been agreed. We know about the Vienna spirit of consensus that governs the UNCAC and everything that relates to the UNCAC. So we need a broad consensus, we need full consensus to actual changes. from your perspective, what can a government do, what can be done on the national level to voluntarily, so to say, strengthen, improve the way one specific review is being conducted? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Thank you, Matthias. Yeah, if we look below the multilateral level at the national level, I think there are 2 points where we could make better use of the reviews, at least. One is really to use the review reports as kind of a looking glass of where are the weaknesses and strengths of our anti-corruption frameworks, the national frameworks, and to use this for evidence-based policy making. And especially this becomes important when you engage in the process of drafting an anti-corruption strategy. In Switzerland, we started a strategy process 3 years ago by really compiling all the recommendations that we had received from OECD, Greco, and also the UNCAC first cycle review. And these were our main sources of inspiration for a long list of possible actions that then were prioritized in the review, in the strategy process. I would therefore suggest that countries use the reviews as a starting point for developing a national strategy. And secondly, I think we could also make better use of the country reviews by in the development cooperation, in bilateral development cooperation. For this, I think it would be important that we publish the full country review reports, and this is encouraged by the terms of reference of the mechanism. But unfortunately, it is not a standard practice, and I have prepared a slide on this that I would like to show. The map it shows countries that have published at least one of their country review reports in green. And as you can see, this is a patchy picture. The reports cover most of Latin America, parts of Africa, and parts of Southeast Asia. But there are important gaps in this picture. Now, why is it important to for the development, for the technical assistance providers to gain access to the country review reports? Just a few months ago, the Swiss Agency for Development Cooperation issued new guidance for its anti-corruption programming. The guidelines set out a few principles, and the first and foremost is understanding corruption. The guidelines say that anti-corruption work must always begin with a robust analysis of the problems at hand and of the context in which they arise. The UNCAC reviews are explicitly mentioned in the guidelines as an analytical tool that can be used for in-depth context assessments. The full country review report is very often the most comprehensive and accurate set of information that you have on a country's anti-corruption framework, including its strengths and weaknesses. And it would really be a pity to keep this confidential, because transparency facilitates the provision of technical assistance, and technical assistance could then enhance the impact of the review process. So that is a practical measure that we see which could enhance the impact of the process along with the national anti-corruption strategies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin, for highlighting these important possible use cases that may be underused at this point. The review reports as a as a tool to inform development cooperation and as an important tool to also inform domestic anti-corruption strategies. Marcela, so as I mentioned, the review process in Honduras is ongoing, and I know that the government of Honduras has decided to go beyond the minimum of the terms of reference when conducting the review mechanism. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you have been doing voluntarily, so to say, to ensure a transparent, effective, and inclusive process?
Yes, this is a very important question, especially given the context of corruption that exists worldwide. Therefore, the states must go further and generate tools that allow to directly counteract the effects of the corruption. Thus, for example, creating monitoring and follow-up platforms and working tables with different actors of Honduran society within the framework of the obligation of the UNCAC Institute voluntary actions that can be carried out to strengthen the review mechanism. Since when civil society is surveillance of the process, work scenarios are generated with greater transparency and accountability, promoting our public authorities, officials, and servants. No go forget about accordance with ethics and probity. Working together help us to obtain comprehensive vision and broader perspective of what we are doing. It is also the way make our actions transparent, generate public value, and strengthen the muscle of our government with citizens, obtain lessons learned, and identify good practices. In addition, a state can create preventive measures through the training programs that involve citizens, youth, children, promoting a culture of transparency and strengthening civic education. A clear example of this is the National Award of Transparency that denominate ambassadors of transparency, launched by the Ministry of Education to promote and forget the culture of values and principles in a deeply rooted way from the person and prevent them from committing acts of corruption in the future. In addition to above, my country has launched the School of Senior Management to develop skills and professionalization of our officials and servants through an accredited academic offer both face-to-face or virtual, so that the country has a modern goods and service that improves the standard of living of the Honduran population. Similar to that, Honduras maintains a wide range graduates in different topics such as access to the public information, open government, open data, among others. We have made it possible to strengthen the competence of our officials and servants, public, youth, and also civil society and others. It hasn't done them. The new knowledge today can replicate in their different participation scenarios and with it make more conscious, responsible, and reasoned decisions, without leaving aside the efforts in the Parliament and Court of Justice, so that through their critical and conscious sense, they can adopt legal mechanisms and promote judicial guarantees and protection that allow to deal effectively with corruption. In this sense, in 2019, a new penal code was approved to international recommendations and standards, incorporating the transnational crimes and strengthening justice system. In the same vein, the judiciary created a mobile app for administrative simplification and transparency of judicial process. This is a little bit resumed what Honduras opened his space to the civil society, to the other representative sectors, to co-create policy, to co-create strategies, to work together and be in an inclusive space that all citizens can participate to make more decision, governance, and again during the corruption.
Thank you, Marcela, for also highlighting what Honduras has done, also as a follow-up to the first cycle. Sisi, so if you were maybe in a position to actually advise your government on what it could do better voluntarily to ensure a truly inclusive process, to maximize the ability of civil society to contribute in a meaningful way, what would be your suggestions for action?
One, I think it's going to be important to ensure that participation of CSOs or NGOs is mandatory, such that it's not optional. Then, secondly, there would be need to publicize the final reports, because when you get the final report, you're able to know what exactly is coming up and how you're going to follow up on the recommendations. So for me, that would be very key for me. And then also need to publicize the review mechanism, the exercise itself, because in most cases you're going to realize that yes, there's a review mechanism happening in the country, but the citizens are not aware. There's hardly any interest when it comes to this mechanism. And remember, ours was conducted at such a time when we had the International Anti-Corruption Week activities. So I would have expected the review mechanism itself to have been widely publicized, such that people get interested in knowing what exactly is happening. Because I presume the review mechanism is one of those important activities that happens. And then lastly, I think for me, the review should be seen as an activity that is aimed at fighting corruption. It shouldn't be an activity that, again, we just tick the boxes because people are coming and they're reviewing our country. How do we ensure that the review mechanism is looked at as an activity that is aimed at fighting corruption, in that the citizens are also going to get on board and embrace the exercise? In most cases, it's only known by government and a few civil society organizations, but how do we broaden it and ensure that it's an activity that each and every person is going to appreciate? Thank you.
Thank you, Sisi, and I think that's an important point you raised, the publicity of the whole process. If civil society is not aware that the process is actually ongoing, at what stage it is, then it is very difficult. It requires a lot of initiative from civil society to find the entry points for possible contributions. And so, Corinna, maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on what you have seen in terms of maybe also some good practice approaches you have seen on the national level, or what avenues you have identified for governments to voluntarily increase the inclusiveness of the review process.
Oh yes, sure. I'd be happy to do that. And I would like to just follow up on Sissy's point that, it really should be required for stakeholders to be engaged in country review processes. I think that's one of our key recommendations from our report. And really, you can see that if you go through the country review documents. The majority of those documents provide, minimal to no information about whether stakeholders were engaged and how they were engaged in the review process. So I think there's two issues. One is that countries should be required to carry out inclusive and transparent review processes. And then I think countries should be required to disclose what they've done to engage stakeholders. There should be a section in country reports and executive summaries that clearly outline stakeholder engagement and the strategy for that. And the good news, though, is that there are some countries, like we've heard from Honduras, that are actually carrying out more inclusive reviews. And so we should learn from this so it becomes the norm rather than the exception. And I can highlight a few examples of this. I would like to also highlight that the UNCAC Coalition has a guide on transparency and participation that lays out in detail how to involve civil societies and other stakeholders at key stages of the process. And I think that's the overall point here, is that governments should start from the very beginning of their reviews and develop a strategy for stakeholder engagement. And by engaging stakeholders in a meaningful way, this is going to ensure a more successful outcome. If you get the perspectives of civil society, the private sector, academia, and others, they have unique perspectives and experiences. They give legitimacy to the process. So the whole process is going to be more impactful if you are more inclusive in your process. So as far as a few highlights of best practices, well, one, I think it's very important at the very beginning of the process to make sure that you're including stakeholders in the development of the self-assessment checklist when you're assessing how well a country is doing. And some countries are not only asking for written submissions from civil society and other groups, but actually holding workshops with stakeholders to discuss the checklist, how the country is doing, and then that is then inputted into the checklist. Another example is, I think, is during country reviews, making sure that you're setting up meetings with all the different stakeholders, and there should be a range of them involved, and that the meetings with reviewers should happen without government representatives in the room in order to ensure a really constructive and helpful dialogue about what's really going on in the country. And then when you have the review report finished, Suki was talking about the importance of publicizing it, and I think that that's a really good point. There needs to be a lot more done to publicize, but why not just not only publicize, but hold events where you're engaging stakeholders and others involved to talk about the report and what was found. And then I think the other very good best practice that can be done is actually involving stakeholders in the follow-up process. And so coming up with a concrete follow-up plan and what all the different stakeholders are going to do. And there are some countries that have taken that on, not as many because there's not as much disclosure about follow-up plans. And I just finally to say, I think one of the best practices is to really think about how to do it in a sustained, meaningful way and not in an ad hoc manner. And there are some countries that have actually created working groups to oversee the review process. And in those working groups, they have representatives of civil society and other non-governmental stakeholders that work with government representatives to develop the whole review process and hopefully the follow-up process too. So that's a really, if it's done right, if it's done in a meaningful way, that could be a really impactful way to do a country review that is inclusive and can be better outcomes.
Thank you, Karina. We had unfortunately some sound issues in the room, but I hope that most of what you said was understood by the colleagues who are joining us. Martin, maybe back to you at this point. Where do you see the need to make the implementation review mechanism stronger, more impactful, more relevant as a whole? I mean, you have already mentioned a few points. You've already hinted at some comparison to other experiences Switzerland has. But in the next few years, I think at some point, you and your colleagues will enter into a discussion, what do we do in the future with the review mechanism? And I was wondering if you could share some thoughts on where you see the potential to strengthen the review mechanism.
Well, I think there are many good ideas that we just heard from other panelists, and there's many things that can be done without amending the terms of reference, just by spreading the good practices, and things like also publicizing the reports, holding a press conference. This could be done by the Secretariat, by the UN representatives in the countries concerned, for instance. But as you said, there is also perhaps the need to work on the multilateral level, and there I see 2 points. One is the inclusiveness of the mechanism to collect inputs from independent sources. There is an article in the convention, Article 63, paragraph 6. It says inputs received from relevant non-governmental organizations duly accredited in accordance with procedures to be decided upon by the Conference of the States Parties may also be considered. This area remains to be developed. I think we do see some civil society engagement as a standard practice in many country reviews. But there is still a lot of potential here, and the procedures could be developed, because it is really important for I think most of all for the reviewers to be aware of what civil society thinks, to not just look at the self-assessment checklist that the government provides, but also to have a second opinion in order to be able to ask the right questions. And if you ask the right questions, then of course the outcome and the findings will be much more relevant and meaningful. And the second point is the follow-up procedures. Clearly, they are quite rudimentary and they need to be further developed as well. And this was already foreseen at the time when the terms of reference were adopted back in 2009. And it will be on the agenda as soon as as we start discussing the next review phase. I think during the next review phase, we will need to certainly revisit the implementation gaps that have been identified in the reviews during the first phase. And by then, countries will have had ample time to consider and follow up on the recommendations that they have received. And we may also want to put less emphasis perhaps on legislation and instead focus more on the actual practice and enforcement by states parties.
Thank you, Martin. This is an interesting list of possible avenues to strengthen the review mechanism. I would encourage the online participants, as we will soon turn to a Q&A session, to put any questions they have in the chat so that we can take their views, their comments, their questions into account. Marcella, from your perspective, where do you see, with your experience, where do you see the need maybe to strengthen the UNCAC review process further?
Okay, as our government and the international community are creating strategies and mechanisms to directly combat corruption. It is adopting new shapes, modalities, and influencing different magnitudes in different aspects of national life. Therefore, it's imperative that the mechanism be able to rethink and restructure its process of evaluation, establishing much more severe and sophisticated standards and criteria that promote states to bend their efforts and act belligerently. Regarding the new phase of the review in case of Honduras, is an on-site visit. We are eager to receive the expert evaluator from the Cook Island and Trinidad and Tobago so that they can verify the progress that we have in the framework of the derived obligation of the UNCAC and also our political and budgetary commitment with the strength to responsible institutions for the prevention, combat, and punish of the corruption. Similarly, we are looking forward to receiving your comment in which we can improve and how we can do a better paper in our implement of the commitment that we have in the UNCAC and commitment all the 6 principles that UNCAC coalition say to all those states part. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcella. And you have, just to emphasize this again, Honduras is one of the 31 countries that has signed the UNCAC Coalition Transparency Pledge. So you have, so to say, made a commitment to go beyond the minimum standards.
That's okay. We were the 27 country that it's joined to the commitment, and our country is very open to do all the spaces that we have to pretend to the civil society to be more inclusive in the nearly visit by the evaluators. We're gonna aperture that space to the civil society, academy, and all the different representatives of the society to be participate of that final phase of the implementation of the second cycle. So there is an important space that the civil society of our countries have to use to participate and have a special paper and can incident in the final phase of the second cycle. And then we are going to continue to publish in the forums, publish all the information relative to the UNCAC commitment and to all the information that we need that our citizens know and that also the civil society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cici, so how from your perspective can this review mechanism, the findings of this review mechanism, how can this inspire or inform future reforms in your country? How do you see a way that this is not just a box ticking exercise, as you said, but this is actually a dynamic, this creates maybe a process that would really allow for the problems to be tackled that are identified. Do you have any thoughts on how that could be achieved?
Yeah, I think the first one, I just want to pick up on what Martin said. I think I now understand where civil society engagement is not so much a priority, because the wording that is being used is may. Governments may consult the relevant. Now, may is discretionary. It is not mandatory. Now, as long as we have words like may, it's still, I mean, you're still going to leave it to government to decide. So I think for me, if we need to make the process more proactive and inclusive, there's going to be need to change some of the discretionary wording that is being used. But I think being more active and proactive, there's going to be need to share the report. If we're able to get the report, then that is going to help us to pick up on some of the recommendations that the reviewers would have given. Then we can be able to engage with government to find out how far, because I would presume that these would be commitments also on the side of government. And if you have a good working relationship with government, you can actually use some of these recommendations to engage. And where necessary, you can try and see where you can offer help and assistance. Because I believe that civil society and government are supposed to work together in synergy. We complement each other. So if we're able to get and see some of the recommendations, we can use some of these recommendations to further strengthen our collaboration and synergy with government.
Thank you, Cici. And Corinna, maybe one more question to you before we open the space for any comments and questions. I think that the question of the follow-up has also come up from several speakers. Could you maybe briefly speak about what you have found in terms of what kind of voluntary follow-up is currently being done, and maybe you have some thoughts on how that follow-up action coming out of a finalized report could actually be conducted in a better way?
Yes, thank you. The answer is that this voluntary follow-up process that we have isn't really working very well. If you look at the first review cycle, you have only 38 countries that have actually published their plans for follow-up. And if for the most recent review cycle, the second review cycle, you have one country, Mauritius, that has actually published a follow-up plan of action. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that follow-up isn't happening, but it's very hard, and you can sometimes get a sense of that in country reports where they say here and there's follow-up, but it's very, very challenging to get a picture of what is going on in a country. Where are they following things up? Where are they not? So I think that our current voluntary follow-up kind of process and disclosure isn't working very well, and that's really one of the key areas that we need to improve upon. And again, if you look at other anti-corruption monitoring mechanisms, they have, like the FATF, the Anti-Bribery Convention, they actually have phases focusing on looking at unimplemented recommendations. So I think there's a lot more that the review mechanism needs to do on that. And for some of our recommendations on how to make it better is, for the cost to lay out a very clear follow-up process to assess whether countries have followed through on their recommendations. We believe that a template would be very helpful so that countries would have a clear way of reporting, a template for reporting on the status of their follow-up actions. And here again, it's very important for there to be inclusivity. These follow-up actions shouldn't be done in isolation. They should be done in partnership with civil society and other non-governmental stakeholders. And they're going to be very important in helping the country actually identify and strengthen their anti-corruption regime. So it's very important to include stakeholders in the follow-up process and to make sure that all the documents, the reports, the templates related to that are made transparent. So I think that these are some ideas that we have for basically ensuring a more robust follow-up process in the future.
Thank you, Corinna. So I would like to now open the floor for questions. Are there any questions in the room? I see at least one hand. Yes, please. Two hands. Yes, please, David.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this is very interesting. We've heard very strong concerns and in terms of the implementation. First, my question will actually go to my sister from Uganda. He talks about the difficulties of trying to engage. I just wanted to understand that when the review was announced in Uganda, was it the Uganda government that invited civil society or not? Because that would be very interesting to also share. At what point the invitation came? Are there a kind of a broad coalition of civil society working around this issue in Uganda? And then my question goes to our friend from Switzerland. Talking about how government is supporting this process to ensure that all stakeholders are carried along. It will be interesting to hear from Switzerland what they are doing around supporting civil society engagement in the IRM process. Thank you.
Thank you. Sissi, would you like to, or maybe since there was, maybe we take two, three questions and then we go to the speakers. So maybe, yes, the lady in the front and then further in the back.
Thank you all the speakers, those physically present here and those who joined us virtually. I think this was a very engaging process and an engaging experience to learn about your different experiences from various countries. My name is Sarah. I work with Article 19, and I wanted to just ask a question and also get to know your experiences based on your specific context, particularly on the sustainability of the mechanism and the review process. For instance, in my experience in the Eastern African countries that we've been engaging in, countries are bombarded with very many even civil society with very many reporting and review mechanisms. Has there been more of an opportunity or considerations of looping in other processes within the UNCAC review mechanisms? For instance, the voluntary national review under the SDGs does have certain aspects that relate to anti-corruption, similarly to the UPR and ICCPR that has various recommendations on policies that could sort of enrich the process. And also this is specific to also broadening the base of stakeholders, because that means you start from a place that people already are familiar with the process, and it's easier to sort of enrich and to piggyback on it. And also so that at least in my experience, a lot of countries start panicking just a year or 6 months ahead of the review and putting together the reports. Then that means the follow-up process and the sustainability of the follow-up process is not usually very sustainable. So yeah, that is just basically my general question to everyone, if there are considerations of looping in or consolidating other processes so that all areas that countries and civil societies are engaging in are able to enrich the UNCAC mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you. And then there was a third question.
Hello, my name is Natasha Sarkis from UNDP Lebanon. So just I wanted to share an experience from our experience with the government in Lebanon and to see if other countries, they are doing the same. So it was at the early stage of engaging civil society. What was also a recommendation from our experience is also to train the civil society on the UNCAC review mechanism, because it's very important that civil society, while engaging in this process, to be on the same page as the government, and to be able also to know that it's a technical process and to see how they could be an added value to this process. So the engagement of the civil society from the beginning is not not only about taking the decision of engaging them, but also into capacitating them with the technical skills to be able to engage at the same level of the government, to know that it's a technical process. And I want to know more maybe about other countries, how they engage on civil society in terms of training, and what are the medium of those trainings and other experiences. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these questions. So, Sissi, maybe do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you very much. On the question that David raised, how we as a civil society, how we ended up participating. One, initially we actually didn't even know that the review was happening. It wasn't until the UNCAC coalition told us that there's something that is happening, and then we were able to get the details of the focal point person, and then that is how we became part and parcel of the process. And that's why I said that I think we only attended only 2 meetings. The checklist has never been published, so we don't even know how many meetings there were supposed to be. So we were only attending based on invitation and based on need basis. I think that is what I can say. Thank you.
Thank you. Martin, maybe I think at least one question was directly directed to you, but maybe you have also thoughts on the synergies between all the different reporting requirements, and on how maybe you have also a perspective on how civil society participation can be facilitated, maybe also by the governments that are in a donor role or in a reviewer role for other countries.
Yes, I think I will focus on how we are implementing that transparency pledge that we made when it comes to the UNCAC reviews. I think it's not just because we made that pledge, it's really also in the best interest of the government to engage with civil society, to have them in the office and not marching on the streets. It's always much better to talk than to protest. So what we did in the preparation now of the second cycle review that we are currently in, we held a virtual roundtable with civil society, NGOs, academia during the self-assessment phase. We have also published on the website the timetable, as far as we know, because there is a lot of uncertainty right now, but the timetable of the review and especially of the country visit. We have also published the contact details of our focal point, which should facilitate for NGOs to take contact and get an update on where we are. Once the country visit will happen, we will certainly grant an opportunity to the NGOs to speak separately to the reviewers, to have a separate meeting without government representatives present there. And once the country review report is complete, it will be published on the UNCAC website, as well as the self-assessment checklist, of course. When it comes to follow-up, the only experience that we have so far is from the first review cycle. We didn't elaborate a specific follow-up plan, but we have this national anti-corruption strategy, which was meant also to follow up on the reviews. And there also we held several workshops that were open to civil society, the private sector, academia, and so forth. This was a very lively discussion, and it really, their participation really enriched our discussions, I must say. Yeah, I'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Do you have any comments, Marcella, on or any reactions to the questions that were posed? What governments can maybe do to better involve civil society, if you also identified the need for some kind of capacity building so that civil society is in a position to contribute?
Yes, I think that the UNCAC provides a broad referential framework with favor different scenarios from which We combat and search of corruption. However, the different forms of corruption are exceeding our capacity. Honduras has been a country that has fully complied with each of the provisions adopted by this plenary. However, throughout their implementation, we have found that UNCAC lacks firms and leaves it discretion to the countries to comply or not with the recommendation. Regarding the straightening of the country of, sorry. Regarding the straightening, the next phase of the review in case of Honduras is on the on-site visit, and we will do whatever UNCAC coalition needs to make our commitment with good and apply all the special that we need to the social sobriety involved.
Thank you very much. Corinna, maybe 30 seconds for any thoughts from you on the questions that have been raised.
Yes, I think it was a really good point made by someone from Lebanon. I'm sorry, about the need for capacity building for civil society and organizations and other non-governmental stakeholders. And so I think that's a really good point, and that's something, again, it's for on the civil society can play a very important role in UNCAC implementation. And so again, that's where more transparency and inclusivity is really important. It's even very difficult to know because of the lack of transparency of country reports, self-assessment checklists, what the capacity needs are in a country, and therefore what should be done to strengthen that capacity. So I know for civil society that is a challenge across the globe, but that is something that the UNCAC Coalition and its member groups have worked on, because we've done so many parallel reports in a country where we've done very detailed assessments of UNCAC implementation, and we've built up our technical expertise on the issue. So I'd encourage everyone to take a look at that. We've got close to 50 parallel reports that have been published, and that shows how in many places we have been building up the capacity of civil society organizations. Hopefully that can build out to other countries, and hopefully we can build on that for the next phase of the review.
Thank you very much, Corinna. I would like to thank our speakers. I would like to thank Switzerland and Honduras for supporting and co-sponsoring this session. I believe this is really only the start of a conversation, because the question of what do we do with the review mechanism, what will its future look like, how can we ensure it is of use in the context of development assistance, in the context of informing national reforms, how can it become more effective, more inclusive, more transparent? All that, I think, will be discussed in the coming years. So again, I would like to invite everybody to look at the research report the UNCAC Coalition published today. I would also like to invite the governments and civil society representatives from countries that have not signed the Transparency Pledge yet, but are still in the process of conducting the review, to consult the pledge and to consider signing it. And finally, I also wanted to share that now more and more NGOs on the national level are using their right to access public information and are requesting from their governments the release of the self-assessments and the full country reports, using the access to documents laws that are in place in many countries by now. So if you are from a government, I would encourage you to release those documents upon request. And if you represent civil society or academia, requesting from their governments the option and so to say take an active role in opening up the findings of the review mechanism. So thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope this is just the beginning of the discussion. We would be very interested in hearing your feedback, your thoughts. Thank you very much for joining us today.